I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
Becket Adams.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, as always, we've got a diverse array of topics this week. Emily is going to kick us off by talking about perhaps the decline and fall of sanctuary cities, aided by conservative policies that are exposing how decrepit and corrupt and ultimately catastrophic they are for their denizens. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ongoing attacks on the Supreme Court and what the actual end game is vis-a-vis 2024 and beyond. Josh is going to talk a little bit about our American gerontocracy. And last but not least, Becket Adams filling in for Inez this week. We'll talk about corporate media's alternate reality. So with that, let's start off with Emily.
Great. Well, thanks, Ben, and welcome to Becket, who works with me over at the National Journalism Center. I'm starting here by talking about a truly incredible turn of events, incredible, tragic when it comes to immigration. It absolutely, we watched, especially in the sort of post-2015 period, this sort of surge of migrants coming from Africa, the Middle East, reshape European politics. We saw the rise of populism in no small part. Helped by that, we've seen the rise of the kind of left reaction to that populism. We've seen flirtations with realignment in different countries, including both in the United Kingdom and here in the United States. And Eric Adams on Wednesday night just waded into this territory. Obviously, he's been at the forefront of opposing what's happening in New York City and sort of becoming a leading Democrat criticizing the Biden administration's policy, because despite all of the virtue signaling that's happened in New York City and in other sanctuary cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, wherever it is, when people are hit by waves of migration, when Democrats are hit by waves of migration, they realize that it strains their safety net. They realize that it puts an incredibly difficult burden on their own communities, on their own social services and policing, and on nonprofits. And this should be obvious to everyone that the costs of having a de facto open border, because of all of the different administrative loopholes that the Biden administration has poked in the system, it is so obvious. It's particularly obvious if you live in a border state, if you live in Arizona, New Mexico, California, Texas. This has been abundantly obvious to you for years, but Eric Adams finally had it. And at a town hall on Wednesday night, I mean, really, really unloaded. He said, "Never in my life have I had a problem that I did not see an ending to. I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. All of us are going to be impacted by this. I said it last year when we had 15,000, and I'm telling you now at 110,000, the city we knew, we're about to lose." Now, he's talking years into this. People in border communities have lost their communities. They have been completely transformed by these waves of migrants, so that people like Eric Adams can virtue signal in his campaign and can feel comfortable at cocktail parties saying, yes, everyone is welcome here. We'll take all of the refugees, all of the asylum seekers, and we are not concerned whatsoever about abuse of the system. We are not concerned whatsoever about security. We are much more concerned about making sure that America is, what did Jim Acosta read from the poem on the Statue of Liberty during the Trump administration? Then some very reasonable concerns that people might have about having, an orderly process, whatever it is. Just as a reminder, I know we've talked about this many times, the Biden administration is allowing migrants to claim asylum in a totally lawless way. We have a system for asylum. The vast majority of people that are claiming asylum right now do not qualify for asylum. They're being trafficked almost 100%. It's in the 90 percentile, if you could actually quantify it, by cartels. They are being kidnapped. They're being tortured. They're being raped. They're being held in indentured servitude in the United States to traffic drugs. They're sending remittances back to Central America to the tune of a huge slice of some of those countries, Mexico, Guatemala, to the tune of a huge slice of their country's GDP is made up of remittances from immigrants to the United States. And again, the cartels are the ones that get them there. Once they get there, they claim asylum. which is a very specific claim to make. And most of them do not qualify for asylum. If you talk to them, we talked to a lot of Haitians when I was at the border last year, and I know we talked about that here. They are all saying they're economic migrants. They have not lived in Haiti for years. And most of them left after the earthquake and lived in Chile, Argentina, in Mexico, in some places. They want new opportunities. They want more opportunities. That's not to say there aren't real safety problems in Central America. It is to say that we are just allowing them to abuse it so that New York liberals can virtue signal and posture. And they can't do that anymore because their own people are being affected by it. So I think what's going to happen is the federal government is just going to keep helping Eric Adams by throwing more and more money at the problem. I don't know. I'm pretty pessimistic about this and everything else. But what do you think, group? Is this finally the straw that's broken the camel's back?
I mean, hard to say definitively, right? But this is a really, really big deal. And I think it's very appropriate that we're leading off the show by talking about it. I mean, Eric Adams obviously ran on a sanctuary city platform. I mean, no one doubts that he is more sensible, that he is less communist, less crazy than his ill-fated predecessor, Bill de Blasio. But I mean, Eric Adams is also not exactly a raging right-winger either. He's not, from my perspective, been as kind of pro-police as he was touted. He was, his kind of police background was very much a thing on the campaign trail. Anyway, he ran as kind of as a liberal. I mean, not going to be a far left guy, but as a kind of doctrinaire down the line liberal. And the fact that he has done a literal 180 from calling New York City a sanctuary city to now saying that this is the first problem that he's ever encountered in his life without end. I mean, the hypocrisy is galling, but I guess when you get past that first impression, you're asking the right question, Emily. I mean, like, is this actually going to be a wake-up call? I mean, Kathy Hochul has had like an ongoing public spat with Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden for months and months now. I mean, this on Wednesday night, this town hall was kind of like the latest eruption, the most kind of viscerally jarring eruption. But Kathy Hochul and Eric Adams behind the scenes and sometimes public really have been kind of chirping at Mayorkas and Biden for months and months to get their acts together. And, one other thing that I think is worth emphasizing is it really does vindicate the DeSantis and Greg Abbotts of the world. And Abbott here deserves a lot of credit. I used to live in Texas. Texas conservatives have a very, shall we say, kind of thorny relationship with Abbott. He's not always the most trusted figure, but on this issue, he was proven entirely correct. Months and months and months ago, maybe even a year ago at this point, Greg Abbott talked about kind of the imperatives of busing people from the border down in Del Rio, down in the Rio Grande Valley, off to liberal jurisdictions, just to make them feel the pain. And clearly that's working like a charm in New York City. I mean, Ben's home state, New Jersey, the governor there, Governor Murphy, saying that he's not even going to accept the migrants. Jared Polis of Colorado, I guess we'll talk about Colorado next, but Jared Polis has been an outspoken critic as well of what's happening at the border there. Will it affect the National Democratic Party level? Very hard to say, honestly, but it's definitely somewhat inspiring to see Eric Adams call reality, I guess.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really fascinating about this, especially in terms of the, I would say, conservative or Republican base, is they say repeatedly they want fighters and put everything else aside. As a matter of pure politics, what DeSantis and Abbott has done, it's been brilliant. I mean, I'm not arguing the morality of it, not arguing even the ethics of it, just as a matter of pure politics and policy and opinion. What they have done has achieved more than any policy paper or any number of press conferences or going on Fox News or whatever, talk radio, and talking about the problem on the border. They made the problem directly the problem of the other states that have been sort of coasting on dunking on a lot of the border states. And if you resist immigration reform, you're racist, et cetera, et cetera. And like Emily was talking about with Acosta, quoting the poem on the Statue of Liberty and all that, Abbott and DeSantis has sort of put this issue directly in their laps and said, okay, now what? And then to sort of watch this reaction, this is probably going to do the most to affect public policy and opinion than anything that has come prior. And again, we can put everything else aside. As a matter of pure politics, I think this is something that the base has sort of been yearning for and screaming for. And I think just in terms of politics, it's been a brilliant move. I haven't seen anything this shrewd or this effective in a long time.
Yeah, I would say this is an example of knowing what time it is, at least in the area of immigration. And if progressivism means anything, it means never having to deal with the brunt of your policies. And this obviously makes every sanctuary city a border city, which I think is a just outcome, frankly, setting aside that it's right on the political merits. I will say, in terms of what is the ultimate consequence or effect of this, As with kind of street crime or radicalism and radical indoctrination in our schools, this will be another test for voters in places like New York City and more broadly of what kind of leaders do you want and what kind of policies do you want them to ultimately espouse and advocate for. Obviously, this is a national policy more than a state level one, but it puts leaders to the test, and it also puts voters to the test of how do they prioritize these various issues? What is their breaking point? Do people flee ultimately and go to, of course, states that have more robust policies and disallow, of course, sanctuary jurisdictions? All those are open questions. And I will say, somewhat glibly, how long until Mayor Adams gets accused of being a proponent of great replacement theory? I put it at maybe a few days at this point. On that note, I will use executive privilege, I guess, and jump into my segment. And I will tee up the segment by talking about the fact that there's been a steady sort of drumbeat. It began prior to the 2022 midterm elections, and now it's picked up about the use of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, to disqualify, quote unquote, insurrectionist candidates. And as we know, 14th Amendment of Section 3 essentially disqualifies for office very specific set of officials, not including the president, mind you, pursuing office, that they are not allowed to do so to the extent they engaged in insurrection, rebellion, et cetera. And obviously, Donald Trump himself has not yet, at least via Jack Smith, been prosecuted for inciting insurrection. We'll see if there's an insurrection or a seditious conspiracy charge to come in a superseding indictment. It took Merrick Garland a while to try to slap any January 6th defendants with seditious conspiracy. But as was reported just, I believe, this morning, we're recording this on a Thursday, so Wednesday of this week, a liberal group, Crew, brought a case basically trying to disqualify Donald Trump from the primary ballot in Colorado on grounds of his having violated 14th Amendment, Section 3. And again, there had been an effort to disqualify a number of state and local officials going into 2022. Virtually all of them failed, with the exception of one county figure, loosely disqualified based on an insurrectionist-tied grounds. But essentially, this question has not really worked its way up through the courts yet. There's been sort of an information operation where the left has glommed onto one analysis put out by academics that some putatively, really formerly, quote-unquote, conservative legal minds have advocated for, arguing that it's a clear case that Donald Trump can be disqualified based on 14th Amendment, Section 3. This, to me, points to a broader theme that I raised in a piece of The Federalist recently, was that there are two kind of emerging themes that appear disparate, but in reality are linked. And the first is that, obviously, Donald Trump is facing a legal jihad with a whole slew of cases. Any of these cases, which may well end up, in certain instances, in convictions, or at least with part of the cases kicked up to superior courts, likely will end up at the Supreme Court ultimately. Same goes for this 14th Amendment Section 3 question, most likely, assuming that judges do not have more sanity prior to the Supreme Court. At the same time, the Supreme Court, of course, has been under withering assault, and this goes back decades, but of course has intensified in recent months. And we could talk about, of course, Borking, to the high-tech lynching of Clarence Thomas, to the Kavanaugh caper. Then we could talk about the Dobbs leak as an assault on the court, as we've talked about before, and also authorities allowing there to be mobs essentially outside the homes of Supreme Court justices in violation of the law, making that decision essentially made under pressure of the mob. And now we have this so-called ethics assault on judges, where there's a push to either force Supreme Court justices to recuse in more instances, maybe try to impeach them down the road, but essentially continue to delegitimize and intensify the pressure on the court and make it appear to be an institution that is an illegitimate, quote unquote, institution. If any or all of these Trump cases end up at the Supreme Court in one form or fashion, one can imagine how intense the pressure is going to be on those justices to, in some instances, recuse or to vote to rule, quote unquote, rightly. And that's where I think, in part, this pressure campaign on the court is going. And I don't think we've even begun to grapple with what it is going to look like in this country if and when any such decision surrounding the presidential election via the lawfare assault on Trump gets there. My question is, what do you make of this thesis? And do you think the Supreme Court will hold? And obviously, it's a sad commentary in and of itself that we're talking about the court as the last potential backstop here. I think it speaks to how perilous the ground is that we're standing on today. So I guess, what do you make of this thesis generally, and will the court hold?
Well, I think if I could jump in, it was fascinating because I was doing some research on Joe Biden this morning, and I was looking up some of the quotes that he had from the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas. And it's funny, before he voted ultimately against Thomas, he issued this warning to his colleagues about, if we go down this road, we're going to be creating precedent that when they come back in, this will all come back to haunt us and bite us in the you know what. And hearing Biden or reading Biden say that now and then looking now at what's happening, it's amazing for these sort of warnings to have gone completely unheeded, despite the fact that they were spoken out loud. You see all this lawfare, that very sort of explicit undermining of the Supreme Court, this story after story after story about Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh and even Neil Gorsuch. And it's funny to see the sort of two-headed monster in media, where you have this avalanche of stories about potential grift or pay for play with Clarence Thomas, all of it nonsense. And the other head of this is the media saying, I don't know what to say about Hunter Biden or Ukraine or any of this stuff. Who knows what? So you have like this very sort of selectively applied questions about graft and pay to play. And so you have that going against the Supreme Court and sort of undermining its the seriousness of it and the all of its authority. And it's merely because they've lost the majority, they being the left. And so going into 2024 or even in the future, seeing the sort of lawfare you're talking about, very dangerous game that even Joe Biden himself said, like, you don't know what you're opening up doing this. And I don't think they can see more than 2 feet in front of them. And it's all dangerous. And I don't know how it dials back or how they slow down at this point, because it seems to be working.
So this has been kind of like the topic of the day among like my law school friends for the past month, is this law review article that came out like 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was actually co-written by Will Bode, who's a 2-time former professor of mine in law school. I actually debated Professor Bode in my Common Good Originalism thesis back in Chicago back in February. So I'm very familiar with the co-authors of this article. Here's what I will say. I think the argument is non-frivolous. I will give it that. I certainly do not find it persuasive. Now, obviously, Section 3 of the entire 14th Amendment, obviously, as one of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, was explicitly drafted in the context of the end of the Civil War, and all the provisions have to be kind of seen through that light. So when Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is talking about insurrection, they are obviously talking about the people of the former Confederacy. So then the question becomes, assuming that Section 3 still has force 160 plus years after the Civil War started, and I agree with Professors Bode and Paulson that it does, that the words simply don't vanish because of the fact that that there are no more Confederates alive. Then the question becomes, does this language apply to the facts of January 6, 2021? And in order to make that logical leap, you have to then be comfortable using the same legal language of insurrection or rebellion for a sprawling 13-state, millions and millions of people rising up in arms to try to assassinate Lincoln, Grant, and the entire Union, versus a riot that got out of hand. And it's also worth noting, I think, that Jack Smith or Fonnie Wilson in her Georgia capacity, but really Jack Smith in his DC indictment, did not invoke the actual statute that involves insurrection. I don't remember the exact citation. It's like the 28 U.S. Code 2080 something. I mean, we'll look it up after the show, I guess. But there is a direct statute that speaks about insurrection. The fact that the special prosecutor, who is obviously vehemently anti-Trump, the fact that he did not feel comfortable going there, trying to get a grand jury to indict on those grounds, I think makes this very, very, very specious. When it comes to the question as to like what would the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately do, I think you can probably safely assume that the 3 liberals would try to disqualify Trump for the very simple reason that the left wing of the court has been politicized for decades and decades. Very hard to have any confidence in John Roberts here, but I will be cautiously optimistic that the other 5 justices would not go there. Obviously, that's not a particularly comforting prediction, is that, you're relying on people like Brett Kavanaugh and whatnot there. But ultimately, I don't think that this is going to amount to much. And to Beckett's point, which is probably the most important point, actually, you would think that Trump's enemies at this point would have learned that all of this lawfare, the impeachments, the Mueller probe, Durham, all this stuff, it doesn't work. All it does is make him stronger. If you want to take out Trump, the way to do it is obviously at the ballot box.
And they just, that's the point that I'll make, is just they've never reckoned with that and developed a good enough argument that's persuasive. And if you're continuing to put up Joe Biden, who, like, let's be honest, is clearly incapable cognitively of doing the job, and you say, if you vote against this man, if you stay home and you don't go pull the lever for Joe Biden, they've just, you are going to destroy the country, et cetera, et cetera. They've used this very coercive and oftentimes extra legal attempt to save the country from Trump, as opposed to actually mounting a serious and persuasive argument to people who don't believe them when they say vote for Hillary Clinton, vote for Joe Biden. This is the only thing that can possibly save America. They've just never reckoned with it. And I think that's why they keep going to the crutch of lawfare. It's their crutch, because they've never, rebuilt the tissue in the leg that allows them to have the muscle to stand up, because they hate the people they need to persuade, and they don't want to have to deal with them. They have nothing but contempt for the people they have to persuade. And some of us may disagree with some of those people. Some of them might be center left. Some of them might be, crazy people, who knows? But you have to persuade people, and you have to have enough respect for them, and you have to see them as dignified human beings who disagree with you, as opposed to just radical, extreme bigots because they happen to come down on a different side of a difficult question.
So with that, let's go to Josh to talk about our American gerontocracy.
Yes, which apparently is a real word. I learned that it's a real word, actually, from an excellent essay from American Affairs editor Julius Krein back in 2020, who was decrying it at that time. And many of us should be decrying it in our present moment. So in case you missed it, before Congress got back into session after the Labor Day holiday, they were back in their home districts last week. And Mitch McConnell, back in Kentucky, froze at the podium for a really painful 30 seconds. It is not an easy video to watch. I do not necessarily even recommend it. And if you're thinking that you're having some sort of whiplash, then you would be correct, because this is the second time this summer that this has happened to Mitch McConnell. He froze up the first time in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol for maybe a little less than 30 seconds, maybe 20 seconds or so. At that time, John Thune, John Barrasso, some of the other Senate Republican leaders ushered him away from the microphone. Something similar happened there in Kentucky. And the McConnell office has not exactly been transparent about what exactly is going on with his health. He took a very bad fall, I believe was in a hotel staircase, if memory serves, way earlier this year. He missed some time for recovery. And we don't really know exactly what is going on with his personal health. We do know that a congressional physician has said that this was not a seizure. Some other people have been speculating maybe it's mini strokes. It's not my particular duty to try, or province, I should say, to try to kind of speculate as to what's going on. I'm the very furthest thing from a doctor, but clearly, clearly it's not great. Clearly it's not great. Mitch McConnell, obviously the longest serving Senate leader in Republican history. I think the longest serving leader of either party. And if this were just about Mitch McConnell, the story wouldn't be that interesting, but it's obviously not just about Mitch McConnell. Dianne Feinstein missed a lot of time earlier this year from shingles. She is now back, and she is certainly not better than ever. She is kind of a shell of her former self, being wheeled around in her wheelchair, not really knowing what to say or when to say it, being prodded by her staff to kind of emit certain words from her mouth. It's really kind of sad to see, frankly. Dianne Feinstein, like Mitch McConnell, been in politics for a very, very long time. This is just not the way these people, frankly, should go out. I mean, go out with some sense of dignity, right? I mean, as a sports fan, I think to kind of the old, proverbial saying that, like, you got to know when it's time to hang up the spikes. I mean, no one wants to see kind of these great players, like Joe Montana struggling to get like a completion over 5 yards from the line of scrimmage. And obviously, Joe Biden is the number one example of this, right? I mean, we can't talk about gerontocracy in America without talking about Joe Biden, who was into his 80s. He is as palpably senile as ever. I mean, fairly recently, after much criticism, he finally found his way out to Maui to try to console the victims of that catastrophic once-a-generation fire. And he had the chutzpah, the temerity, to try to compare to what could easily amount to 1,000 deaths, 1/3 of 9/11. He had the chutzpah to compare that to a fire in his Delaware home where he was like, oh, my wife barely made it out. And the Wilmington, Delaware firefighters referred to this as a small kitchen fire that was put out with a fire extinguisher. Obviously, that is far from all of our concerns with Joe Biden. He is falling up and down staircases. He tripped while handing out diplomas at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs back in June. He had that truly bizarre end to a press conference a few months ago where he just kind of awkwardly smirks at the audience and says, God save the Queen, man. I'm sure that y'all remember that. And it just piles up and piles up and piles up. And the question that many have been debating over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, increasingly or so, is what to do about it. And, granted that there are some counterexamples, we should be fair here. Chuck Grassley, who turns 90 years old, I believe, later this month, actually is sharper than ever. Chuck Grassley has been exceptional on all things Hunter Biden, Burisma related, among other things. He's still very good at his job. But I guess then when it comes to the narrow debate over term limits and age limits, I failed to be compelled. I am not persuaded by the arguments against age limits. So I guess if I had my druthers, I would prefer that we actually amend the Constitution to impose age limits across all constitutional office holders. I think many other Western style countries already have this in their own constitutions. And admittedly, any kind of remedy of this nature is going to be both over and under inclusive, Chuck Grassley being a good example here. But at the end of the day, America is now currently in the midst of a slow roiling cold civil war against China. We are weaker on the world stage than we've ever been. We are rotting from within in many ways than we have ever been before. And it just makes so much kind of common sense to me that we would want people who are not acting like this in public leading us. I mean, that's a very straightforward, simple thing to say. So I guess I do kind of come down on the side of age limits, which make even more sense to me, frankly, than term limits, which was kind of the Tea Party era bugaboo. So I'm curious what you guys think of this. I'll end with one quick statistic, which is I was going over some data earlier this summer for the U.S. Senate. Apparently, there are more U.S. senators aged 70 to 79, so in their 70s, than senators aged 50 or under combined. So I'll leave with that statistic.
I have just two quick thoughts on this. One, it seems, maybe this isn't the best way forward, but it seems fair to me that if there's a minimum age for office, there should also be a maximum age for office, just for the simple fact that at some point, like you're saying, you do lose your fastball. This is a very important position it carries a lot of power and a lot of influence in the world, and to not even be able to form a coherent sentence might be a problem. Perhaps that's me. And the other thing too, though, is I don't know about term limits. I think I'm with you where it's kind of an open question, because I understand. Personally for me, I think it's distasteful to cling to these sort of jobs as a career. It should be something you leave your medical practice for a couple of years and do some public service, and then you go back to your firm. But instead, some people have made a very lucrative career being senators since, again, Joe Biden's been working in the federal government since Richard Nixon was in the White House. He's made a very lucrative career out of this. I don't think it should be a career, but part of the reason I come down against term limits is there's obviously something to be said for experience. Like to your point, we're in the slow rolling war with China. What happens when you have a bunch of babies heading up Congress? There is something to be said for having people who've been there, who have dealt with this, who have, whether or not they fought in the Cold War, and now they're, working in the U.S. Senate. So I don't exactly know where to go for this, but it does seem to me that perhaps a maximum age is not too unreasonable.
So obviously, this opens up a Pandora's box of interesting questions, term limits and age limits both. And on the term limits, I think we'd probably all agree that the longer you're in power, the more entrenched you get in that power. That leads to all manner of potentially corrupting aspects to it. And then beyond the fact that you could, as an incumbent having that advantage, end up in a place where you're in office so long that you're essentially cognitively deficient by the end of it, to the detriment of the public. On the other side, as Becket noted, there's also the wisdom in being in office for that long and knowing the ins and outs, and having the authority that might go along with it that could make a difference at a really pivotal time. And so, on the age and term limits, to some extent, they kind of go hand in hand. From a practical perspective, I've always thought it's hard to envision there being term limits in Congress, precisely because why would they ever vote to limit their own power, ultimately their own livelihood? We should seek out a world where people are only in office for a small amount of time, and when they get out of office, they aren't able to essentially monetize their past power. Obviously, instead, we have the kind of corruption that we see today, the legal corruption that exists. Maybe that's another topic worth grappling with at some point, and maybe it'll be talked about in context of a Joe Biden impeachment inquiry. But you also have to look then at, what about like a John Fetterman? Should there be restrictions imposed to keep someone like that out of office, who's clearly, by any number of standards, it would seem unable or unfit for his office on any given week? However, once you go down this path of saying, let's look at a whole slew of potential restrictions, imagine how your worst political enemy would use that opening to try and create restrictions for office. And think for a second as a leftist. If it was an open question, all these different qualifications that we have really held as sacrosanct and basically said, let's let the voters impose their own age limits and their own term limits and entrust it to them besides the age minimum. What do you think the left would impose if it became an open question what the qualifications ought to be? And so I think as we move forward, to the extent this becomes a real live issue, we ought to be thinking about how the other side is going to try to manipulate and exploit this to ultimately further cement its hold on power.
Yeah, and also I mean, we kind of talked about this in the last segment. I definitely agree with Josh. I don't think age ceilings are unreasonable at all, because we have the basement, we have the floor. So it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that you would then carry that logic into a limit. At the same time, I do, as we were talking about in the last segment, always lean towards letting that stuff get hashed out at the ballot box. But then you look at John Fetterman and say, well, we don't have a functioning media right now. So the framers envisioned our republic working only with a free press. And when you don't have a free press for a million different reasons, I mean, we do have a free press, we just don't have a press that acts like it's a free press. So when you don't have that situation and voters get zero transparency side, except for one interview that Dasha Burns did and basically like felt badly about for the rest of the time. And, you have a debate that happens after all of these votes are cast in what should be obvious to everyone is also extrajudicial like procedure. Then, it's tempting to say one of the ways to get this all working again is, one of the only ways to get this all working again is to sort of make the swamp less of a hot tub, as Becket and I both work at the National Journalism Center, which is founded by Stan Evans, who is the originator of that wonderful quote about the swamp being a hot tub, and people getting to the swamp and realizing it's more of a hot tub. I favor term limits if we're going to do something more than an age restriction, but I also feel like that's an uphill battle and impossible. So we're just throwing our hands up in the air again. But at a certain point, what else can you do? That makes me really sad just now.
The answer is the American people have to demand it of their leaders. I'll take the final word on that for now, and then someone can challenge me in parting shots on that one. But with that, let's turn it back over to Becket to talk about that corrupted media, regime media that Emily was just talking about.
Okay, so now what's fascinating is in the entertainment landscape, as we have seen over the past years, it is splintered into 1,000 pieces. And with that, I think there's a sort of downside, or at least a byproduct, where we don't have cultural touchstones like we used to 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so as in terms of general comity and peace in culture, we're kind of all over the place. It's harder for us to find things that we have in common. It's harder for us to have a common conversation or language. That's something I think a lot of people have sort of zeroed in on. It's not like the 1950s or 60s where he's like, oh, did you watch I Love Lucy last night? Did you watch Bachelor Love Island? The cake is not real. I was like, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. Likewise, one thing that I think that Emily and I have sort of zeroed in on that is equally distressing is that the media, the news media, the press, which is supposed to be sort of gatekeeper of fact and historical record, operates increasingly in an alternate universe where they are not operating under the same set of facts or records that the rest of us are, at least conservatives or people on the right. Something that made me think about that more recently is Atlantic staff writer Franklin Foer, who's out with a new book about Biden, which looks fascinating. It's a fun read that I've read so far. He was on MSNBC recently, and they were discussing the Biden White House's sort of delusional belief that Biden's low approval rating is because they have a communication problem. They're simply not communicating how great Biden is, and because the media has been too tough on him. And Chuck Todd actually surprisingly pushed back on that a little and asked follow-up questions. I know it's weird for Chuck Todd. And he was like, you really think that they're a little too tough on Biden? And Franklin Foer's sort of reasoning was that, they overdid it with Trump, understatement. And so now they're trying to be center and be super objective to the point where I can actually pull up the direct quote. He was saying they're probably tougher on Biden than he deserves. I hear that quote, and this isn't to disparage Franklin or really kind of just dunk on him, but it is to me such a wild statement that this press of all sort of iterations is too tough on Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who can basically get away with a lot of things that even other Democratic presidents could get away with. If President Obama treated Gold Star families and veterans the way that, say, Biden does, we would be hearing about Jay Carney or Josh Earnest would be up there apologizing, sweating profusely. We barely even hear about it. We barely even hear about any of this stuff. We talk about that damned laptop, which has been sort of like on the periphery of media. You have people like Philip Bump at the Washington Post state out loud, yeah, it looks weird, but I have absolutely no interest in investigating this. You look at anything from that. You look at, Biden is famously, again, like we were saying, he's been in politics. He's been in federal politics since the era of Nixon. Infamously short-tempered, tasteless, and boorish. And then around 2008, he decided to rebrand as, the ice cream loving Grandpa Joe. And the media that had been following him and covering him for 30 years were like, okay, we're cool with that. I mean, the few people get as big a pass and then get as coddled and babied as Joe Biden. So to hear this statement from Franklin Foer is just, what universe are we all just operating under a completely separate language? So again, going full circle, the sort of fractured or splintered entertainment landscape, we aren't even talking the same language. And in terms of public comedy and where are we as a nation in public discourse, I feel increasingly things are not just dangerous in the first place, but we're not just talking past each other. We don't even know what the other person is saying. And it feels like we're in a sort of specifically precarious position at that point.
Yeah, that's a good description. And the Franklin Foer book does seem fascinating for that very reason that, and I think we actually talked about this on the show at the time. I remember thinking, as soon as the sort of changing the guards happened in the White House briefing room, that they were going to occasionally be sort of theatrically aggressive towards Joe Biden to prove, because they were coming out of the Trump administration, that there was some parity in their treatment of case study A and case study B. And I think we saw that, especially with the Afghanistan withdrawal is probably the worst media moment for the Biden administration so far, because it was, go ahead, Becket.
I was going to say there's two, and just to sort of push back a little bit on him, he said they've been too tough. There are at least two big moments when I do think the press has been hard on Biden, but it was 100% deserved, and none of it was overly hard. One was the Afghanistan withdrawal, and the other was his extremely nonchalant, bizarre response to the Maui wildfires. All that criticism was completely unlevel, and what he got for Maui wasn't even close to what, say, George W. got for Katrina. But so I don't understand that, too tough. What are you even talking about?
Yeah, and Inez was really intentional. She's been really intentional about keeping Maui and everybody at the center of everybody's conversation, because if he were George W. Bush, if he were Donald Trump, it would be, and rightfully so, because the scope of that tragedy should put it front and center in our news cycle right now too. I mean, it's a crazy news cycle, but at the same time, it should be right up there, and yet we're really hearing less and less about it. But there are moments that, sadly, the press seems to relish, what they should relish every single day, what they should relish when they're talking about Dianne Feinstein, who, by the way, that was the biggest deal in the world when the seal was finally broken. And it was like Politico published a story being like, hey, she is not well, a year and a half ago. And I think Politico also said it had been the biggest secret in the Senate that she was unwell. And that is a self-indictment. They don't even realize that that's an indictment of themselves for not reporting that story earlier, not telling the people of California earlier, when she's in position of leadership in the Senate, a hugely powerful position that her constituents deserve better from. So I think that's a good point, Becket. When we don't share, it's still the most accurate thing that was said during the Trump administration is alternative facts, because again, the media was like, oh, it sounds so Orwellian, blah, blah, blah. But it's true. We all have different things that are in conflict with one another, that are mutually exclusive. that are facts to us and not facts to them. But the real problem, I think, is the media acting as though their facts are unimpeachable when often their facts are merely just points of bias. And when you see yourself as a neutral arbiter and you're not, and you tell your people, you tell your readers, your audience, and the country that you're a neutral arbiter and you're not, that's the real problem. If I have a fact wrong and I'm openly conservative and I say I'm openly conservative, that's okay. Somebody can correct me and we can all realize that I'm coming from a position of bias. If I say that I am the voice of God and I get a fact wrong, it's a different problem.
You know, there's actually a long history, and this is a point that I like to make sometimes. There's actually a very long and old history in America of publications, of media outlets is basically outwardly proclaiming their biases. So like going back to the founding of the country, I mean, in the infamous election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, you know, you had warring newspapers that were overtly partisan. On the one hand, you had the Jeffersonian, Madisonian newspapers. On the other hand, you had the Federalist Party newspapers. And did they engage in kind of defamatory language sometimes, talking about kind of Thomas Jefferson's kind of ill-conceived children, and was John Adams like a tyrant or a dictator? I mean, sure. By the way, incidentally, this is back when defamation law was actually a thing. It was way before New York Times versus Sullivan, but we'll hold that rant for another day, I guess. But the point is that back then, in kind of the first election cycles when America was first becoming a still very young country, people who were going to the media to get the information knew exactly what they were getting. And there's something to be said for that. I mean, honesty is a very good thing. I mean, it is a simple lie. It is a total lie for the New York Times to pretend that what is happening on the quote unquote news side of the publication on A1 is not entirely through kind of a filtered leftist pro-democratic party, pro-Biden regime lens. I mean, this whole kind of old kind of Chinese wall, so to speak, between kind of the opinion team, the editorial team, and the news team, for most publications has just totally and completely collapsed. And by the way, when it hasn't collapsed, it always is in a way that militates to the left. So the Wall Street Journal is a good example. The Wall Street Journal editorial board is of course center right. It's kind of a historical voice of the Chamber of Commerce Republican establishment. The Wall Street Journal news team, to the extent that it leans one way or the other, is definitely not right leaning. It would probably be slightly left leaning, if anything. So when there is an imbalance, it always ends up favoring the left there. But yeah, I mean, I have always been a strong proponent of outlets just outwardly and forwardly proclaiming their biases. I guess if there's one silver lining from our perspective, it's that the media routinely ranks among the institutions in America that the people least trust. It is always kind of down there along with Congress and other institutions for what is the absolute least trusted and most despised institution in America. So good job, media, if you're trying to earn that accolade.
Yeah, the media, broadly speaking, has richly earned our distrust. And, you know, in terms of, first of all, I just laugh at the whole, well, the messaging just isn't good enough, which was something that I recall that Obama mouthpieces also would resort to at times. And really what they're saying is the public is just too dumb to understand why our policies are so great for them. And so we have to explain it a little bit more clearly for the rubes out there, or we need to propagandize them better and harder. And of course, that is what the media exists for. I mean, I obviously take a pretty cynical view of this, as is my wont, but you know, why wouldn't they be at all critical of Joe Biden about anything beyond the fact that he's obviously a vessel for their shared agenda? Well, it also doesn't sell. Donald Trump reemerging sells. That is the thing that kept these corrupt and decrepit media entities alive previously. So, you know, just going after Joe Biden and actually being journalists because he merits pursuing these critical stories, like, for example, the corruption and compromise of the first family, and whether and to what extent that looms over every single substantial national security and foreign policy issue. Yeah, of course it merits it, but why would the press pursue it? Because the press's objective is not ultimately to illuminate the world for us and to, you know, hold the powerful to account and speak truth to power. It is to ensure that the regime they speak for remains in power so that they retain their power and privilege. And it's a sad way to look at the world, but I think it's the proper assumption and premise to go on. And, you know, once again, the media has richly earned it. And I'll just say, I totally agree with Josh. Media figures should be open and unabashed about what their positions are. But even if you have a particular slant, you should still strive to present the best argument that the other side makes from the most credible voices, and do the same on the other side to the extent you are engaging in actual journalism and not opinion writing. And of course, that is not where our media is at all in its quote unquote straight reporting today. So with that, let's go to parting shots with whoever wants to kick it off.
Well, I want to connect that back to what happened with Eric Adams, and what happened with the sort of lawfare too, because you wouldn't be able to get away with this kind of partisan activity in a lot of these institutions, be it the DOJ, the court system, like Weiss, the Delaware court system, the FBI. Like, you would not be able to get away with this. When J. Edgar Hoover was pulling stuff, there were reporters that took the bait. Some reporters took the bait, but a lot of them didn't. And we eventually came to see this as very shameful because Congress, shined a light on what had been happening extralegally at the FBI and the CIA. And we internalized that as a country and recognized from a sort of bipartisan vantage point how unhealthy it was, how unconstitutional it was, and how dangerous it was. And then it continued to metastasize in the shadows for years and years. And we are where we are now because of the sort of negligence, because we don't have these same sort of shared standards. And a lot of that is because the people who run our institutions have given up on them because they're no longer able to recognize their own bias. They're not able to recognize basic like facts to get back to the fact point. I just think it's really important because with Eric Adams, the Biden administration would never, ever, ever, ever be able to get away with what it's been doing at the border if there was a healthy Justice Department, Department of Homeland Security, and certainly, above all, if there was a healthy media that didn't encourage only showing AOC crying at the border under Trump, but not giving a damn when the same thing was happening under Obama, and not giving a damn when the same thing happens under Biden. It's just remarkable. It's why nobody trusts them, but it's also why we don't have accountability. And that's not to say that Republicans don't need accountability. Of course they do, but the left gets zero accountability, and the Republicans are constantly being held to the insane standards of the left that doesn't apply any of these standards to themselves. So it is a lot worse on the left. There's just no question about it, and it doesn't solve any of the problems on the right either. It creates more and more problems. If you so deeply detest populism, then you should stop giving people reasons to be populists, which they haven't recognized thusly either. So that is just to say, probably one of the biggest problem from my perspective is the media, which is supposed to be the one institution that keeps all the other institutions accountable, but it's so broken, we don't have that accountability, and that's where these issues have gotten so dramatically bad.
Yeah, I can jump in. I have two quick thoughts. One being that I said earlier during the Eric Adams talk, the question of the ethics of what DeSantis and Abbott have been doing. That's a very real debate and discussion where that could probably take up several hours. The ethics and the morality of immigration reform. I think there's blame going all around for what is happening on the border. Like Emily was saying, like there's a tragedy happening every day on the border, and we have to do something about it. It's interesting to see the sort of raw politics of how to change or influence policy coming out of both Texas and Florida. But this goes back to the thing about media is that when you have, I think it's the same thing that we see with talking about gerontocracy, is that you have these sort of interests that become so entrenched, that become fat and flabby and just sort of biased, I guess is a good word for it, where they kind of lose the core function of what are you supposed to be doing and what do you do here. You have these newsrooms not just looking the other way, but it's one thing we talk about what Ben was saying, there's a sort of financial incentive to Donald Trump running again. Absolutely. All these newsrooms were bragging about their subscription numbers, their viewing numbers, their page clicks when Donald Trump was president. He was the best thing to happen to most of these newsrooms in a long, long time, short of an act of God or a natural disaster. He was the biggest ongoing news event. So there is, of course, a financial structure to promoting him and looking the other way for Biden. There's also ideological reasons to look the other way for Biden. The thing that sort of shocks me or worries me even more than all that, because again, like you were saying, newspapers used to be outwardly biased. And so to see the New York Times and the Washington Post acting that way, yeah, that's how it has been. The only difference is they're pretending they're not, which is annoying, dishonest, and it drives up distrust. But the thing that really worries me is you have people who are good writers, who are clever writers, people who are ostensibly, very intelligent and very well read, people like Franklin Foer, who will say something like, Biden, the press has been tougher on him than it probably should be. And it's such a bizarre statement that doesn't comport with what I'm seeing in front of me. That is what worries me, is that what what all realities are we both operating in? Because I'm not seeing what he's seeing. I'm not even seeing close to that. And that's the thing that worries me in terms of how do we form a common language that we can at least start debating from, that we can at least come to some sort of agreement or consensus from. And at this point, we are so far away. I have no idea what he's talking about. And he likely has absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. There was a piece that Howard Kurtz wrote recently criticizing me because I was sort of taking on this whole empathetic Joe Biden thing, which is a complete fabrication. It's a branding effort by Biden that the press has sort of just played along with despite knowing better. And Howard Kurtz took umbrage with that, saying, I know Joe Biden. I've seen him play water gun fights with children, and he lost his wife and daughter. He is a man of empathy. And I was just reading this piece. I was like, how does that mean you're empathetic? I mean, where is the actual empathy? People keep telling me he's empathetic. And what worlds are we in? Because I ain't seeing it. They ain't providing the evidence of it. And people are just alleging these things. And so in terms of, and I know I can't now, I'm sort of repeating myself, in terms of public discourse and maybe taking the temperature down, or at least finding somewhere where we can work together, I don't know where we can begin or start doing that if we're not, again, just talking past each other, we're speaking completely different languages.
So I'll go for, go ahead, Ben.
No, go for it, Josh.
So I was going to go in a very different direction. So Joe Biden, Thursday evening. I mean, we're recording this on Thursday, so I guess it will be last night or whatnot by the time you hear this. But he's unveiling this new 30-second ad entitled "Got to Work," and it's meant to shine a spotlight on Bidenomics. And if you haven't been paying attention, they're trying really hard to make Bidenomics a thing. They have been trying really against all the relevant polling on this, against all of the polling that suggests that Americans think that Joe Biden has done an absolutely horrible job of managing the economy. They're trying to make Bidenomics the new Reaganomics. And my column this week is basically just saying that I guess I can only rationalize it by thinking that there's literally nothing else to tout. I mean, what possibly else could he tout? Could it be the immigration crisis? The members of his own party, from Eric Adams to Kathy Hochul to Jared Polis, are now kind of crying out for it. Could it be his foreign policy, where you have the members of the 13 slain on the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan kind of raising all hell, when you have China on the loose situation in Russia and Ukraine? I mean, there's really nothing possibly for him to point to. And it's a profound cynicism. I mean, I was on Newsmax earlier this week, and the somewhat colorful analogy that I used was that the Biden regime trying to kind of thrust Bidenomics onto you is basically like serving a turd sandwich and pretending like it's filet mignon. And I have to think that the American people are not dumb enough to fall for that. And maybe call me naive. I mean, people have fallen for swindlers any number of times here. But I mean, anyone who has lived over the past 2 years, who experienced the highest inflation in 4 decades last summer, 9.1% at its absolute peak in the annualized CPI index. We formally entered a recession before the facts that, before Karine Jean-Pierre and the other kind of band of idiots trying to kind of redefine the previously universally accepted definition of recession. I mean, anyone who has lived the past 2 years knows that Bidenomics is not a good thing. And I just think that this is quite comical, and I do not think it's going to succeed.
We'll see if I can try to wrap a bow on some of the themes that we've covered today. Becket was sort of talking about how we live in 2 realities, and I would point to one recent development that illustrates kind of what the end of all this is, and that is these terrorism enhancements that were applied to the cases of several Gen 6 defendants, one of whom, Enrique Tarrio, a Proud Boy, was sentenced to 22 years in prison. He was not even in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, but in connection with the January 6th Capitol breach. And they've essentially made Americans domestic terrorists who, some of whom, but not all of whom, participated in a protest that boiled over into a riot that day. And that is the ultimate end of inhabiting 2 completely different universes, where we can look at we can look at the facts on paper and come to entirely different, and in some cases, wholly opposite and antithetical conclusions about what those facts and the evidence ought to lead us to. And of course, what is kind of the root cause of us living in 2 alternate universes? Well, it comes down to inculcation within our households and in our communities. And then, of course, the schools. And that's why for the left, it's so imperative to have control of education, because if people do not learn basic facts and knowledge, they don't have a grounding in our history, they don't have a shared understanding of it in any single respect, well, easier to pit people against each other and use that to obtain power. And of course, if people lack critical thinking abilities, in addition to any sort of historical grounding and grounding in facts and knowledge, then all the easier to ultimately control them. And so there's a vicious feedback loop here of an education system, which is really an indoctrination system that turns out people who can be made to be sheep, essentially, and cloistered in an alternative universe for the end of power at the end of the day. So, just to add on to that, on a disparate thread, but related to my segment on the whole 14th Amendment Section 3 thing. Well, also, let me just add first, before that on Beckett's piece about the media, my colleague at Real Clear, Carl Cannon, has a piece out, The Rise of Unapologetically Partisan News Reporting, that I urge everyone to check out because it provides a lot of interesting facts about the history of kind of partisan media and where it's ultimately going. I'd also point folks on my point about the 14th Amendment, Section 3. Obviously, every single week we talk about the weaponization and hyper-politicization of the justice system. And, kind of aghast as I was about to take a 1-week vacation, which I was off last week, in looking at what happened down in Fulton County and the Trump mugshot, I dashed off a piece over at my Substack, and I just titled it, "Our ruling regime is hell-bent on throwing its political foes in prison. Do our leaders have any earthly idea what time it is?" And I would leave everyone with that question because it just strikes me that it's never been more apparent that the ruling regime is willing to stretch and torture the law. And it's not just about throwing Donald Trump in jail and ultimately to die in jail potentially, or lawyers around him or anyone else who could be associated with election challenges in 2020, but it's really anyone who ultimately is perceived to pose a threat to regime power is going to have to consider whether or not they're going to have the full force of the Justice Department come down on them. That is the kind of fear of God that the regime is trying to instill in people. And if you are an elected official and every day you are not thinking about and actually acting to fight regime tyranny as the number one singular issue on which everything else relies, then what are you doing as an elected official? And that's kind of the question that I would leave the group with and our audience with for today, and maybe something that we'll pick up next week. So on that note, on behalf of Josh, Becket filling in for Inez, and thanks for that, Becket, and Emily, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.